This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning. The administrative staff has informed us that he must leave this hearing at noon, leaving less than 2 hours for member questions. So in order to afford more members the opportunity to engage with the administrator, I've asked that each member be limited to a total of 4 minutes to ask questions. Without objections, so ordered. I want to note for the record that we received Administrator Wheeler's testimony less than 24 hours before the start of the hearing. We did give sufficient notice for this hearing. It is important for members and staff to be able to review testimony prior to the hearing to properly prepare. We expect that in the future hearing, we'll receive the EPA's testimony at least 48 hours in advance. I'd like to welcome our administrator, good morning, Mr. Wheeler, to the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology for the first time. The members of this committee look forward to your testimony today, and as we all understand and value the important role of EPA plays in health, safety, and prosperity in our communities. I know I speak for many of my colleagues when I say that our constituents also understand the importance of a strong EPA, and they are paying attention to the decisions being made here in Washington. They reach out to us when they hear about dismantling of clean air standards because they're concerned that it could exacerbate their children's asthma. They reach out to us when EPA's own IRIS assessments show that chemicals being released from nearby facilities could pose serious health risks to their families. They reach out to us because Congress has a responsibility to the American public to protect their best interests through dedicated oversight of the federal agencies that are supposed to be protecting our health and safety. This administration has shown that its priorities do not lie with the average American. Draconian cuts and the President's budget request have sought to cut funding for EPA's research and development nearly in half. The research that EPA funds has been vital to the development of this landmark public health protection. The research conducted and supported by EPA is not replicated by any other local, state, or federal agency. Cutting this critical research to the levels proposed by this administration would be an insurmountable loss to environmental science and public health. It is profoundly disturbing to see the actions this EPA has taken to dismantle many of its own standards and regulations that were established primarily to protect public health. This administration's push to deregulate seems to be led by political ideologies with limited input from scientific experts. Remarkably, sometimes this administration's zeal to roll back public health protection even exceeds the desires of industry. Many members of the regulated community have come out in opposition to EPA's recent actions to roll back regulations on glider trucks, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, and EPA's unprecedented and ill-advised revocation of California's authority to set its own clean car standards. Since the establishment of the EPA nearly 50 years ago, this country has shown that we can protect everyone, from our most vulnerable populations to our most healthy, without sacrificing economic growth. But it is naive to think that because the EPA has been so successful in accomplishing its mission over the past decades, that we can now roll back regulations in order to benefit industry and expect no negative impacts on public health. Environmental protections is an ongoing process. It requires a persistence that is exemplified by the dedicated scientists and engineers who work at EPA. These committed public servants have the full support of the American people, but they need your full support, Mr. Administrator, as well as full support of Congress to help them to continue to carry out the agency's mission. Let me be clear, gutting the roles of science and EPA's regulatory and decision-making processes will not make our air safer to breathe or our water safer to drink. As a congressional committee with jurisdiction over research and development activities at EPA, my colleagues and I take our oversight role very seriously. We have attempted to engage with you and your staff on a number of occasions and issues that directly impact public health. We're still waiting for adequate responses from the agency on many of these inquiries. Simply stating the total number of pages of documents provided to the committee does not address whether they are responsive to the request. I hope this will not be the only time that we can see you before the committee, and today marks the start of an open dialogue between our members and yourself. We look forward to working together with you to ensure that the best interests of the American public are at the heart of EPA's actions, and that those actions are informed by the high caliber science that distinguishes EPA on the world stage. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, and thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here today to discuss the EPA's fiscal year 2020 budget request. The EPA is charged with the broad and vital mission of protecting our nation's air, land, and water. From hazardous waste cleanup to protecting human health to setting clean air and water standards, the EPA's work affects every American. While much of the EPA's regulatory mission falls under the jurisdiction of other congressional committees, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology oversees the EPA's work on environmental research and development. This R&D is critical to providing sound science needed for the EPA to effectively carry out their mission to protect our environment. I'm looking forward to a discussion about the role science and technology play in the agency's mission, and I'd like to encourage my colleagues to focus on the important jurisdiction when questioning the administrator. In my many years on both the Ag and Science committees, every discussion of the EPA included talk of overregulation. In the past, it seemed like instead of protecting the environment, the EPA was more focused on pursuing a political agenda that led to an expansive and, I might add, expensive regulatory burdens. Fortunately, this is no longer the case. Under the leadership of Administrator Wheeler, the EPA has shifted from top-down, one-size-fits-all regulations to a flexible, technology-driven approach that works with local communities to protect our environment and maintain economic growth. I'm confident that under the leadership of Administrator Wheeler, America will remain the gold standard of environmental protection around the world. And by leveraging new technologies, we can protect our environment without imposing sweeping government mandates. As the ranking member of the Science Committee, I may be biased, but I believe that technology should be the cornerstone of our efforts to reduce global emissions and address our environmental challenges. American industry is already making great strides by investing in technologies like carbon capture, advanced nuclear, and energy storage. EPA should encourage the adoption of innovative ways to monitor and reduce emissions, while allowing us to use all of our natural resources safely and effectively. This is the kind of approach that has helped significantly improve air quality in the United States. According to the EPA's most recent Air Trends report, the number of unhealthy air days, along with the emissions of key air pollutants, have declined since 2000. Our fine particulate matter levels are 5 times lower than the global average, and we've made progress while growing our economy. Under the Trump administration, I've been pleased to see the EPA focus on using sound, transparent science to develop environmental solutions that will bring all the stakeholders to the table. If we want our policies to be successful, they need to be based on the best available science and also be achievable without damaging our economy. I believe the administration is working hard on both. I also want to take a moment and applaud Administrator Wheeler for finalizing the first step to repeal the Obama administration's WOTUS rule this week. This rule was exactly the wrong way to protect the environment, a federal government power grab that made it harder for farmers, ranchers, and landowners to do business. By returning to limited regulatory authority established under the Clean Water Act, the EPA has taken a balanced approach that both supports our environment and our economy. But don't let anyone fool you. Rolling back this regulation had nothing to do with ignoring the science. and it won't lead to more pollution in our waterways. In fact, the Trump administration has prioritized efforts to improve water quality by investing in water infrastructure. Although the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan program and the State Revolving Funds program, the EPA has helped local communities modernize outdated infrastructure and improve water quality. This investment will improve the health and safety of our nation's waterways and create jobs. I'm sure that we'll hear criticisms of the EPA today. I hope that instead of falsely attacking the agency's anti-science or focusing on Administrator Wheeler's predecessor, we can make this a productive hearing where we honestly assess the work being done to protect the environment. I believe the EPA is on the right track and is working to find a science-based collaborative approach to ensure all Americans and future generations we can enjoy a cleaner, safer, healthier environment. I want to thank Administrator Wheeler again for his hard work, along with all of the staff at the EPA, and I look forward to hearing his testimony this morning. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Before we open, I want to welcome the Moms Clean Air Force in the audience in red T-shirts. Parents United Against Air Pollution, thank you for coming. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witness. The Honorable Andrew Wheeler currently serves as the 15th Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Wheeler has spent his career working on environmental topics, started his career as a Special Assistant to the EPA's Pollution Prevention and Toxics Office under the H.W. Bush administration. He spent 12 years on the Senate Committee of Environmental and Public Works, serving 6 of those years as Chief Counsel and Minority and Majority Staff Director. In 2009, Mr. Wheeler shifted to private sector work and was the principal and team leader of the Energy and Environment Practice Group, as well as co-chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Group at the Frager Baker Daniels Consulting. He was nominated to serve as the Deputy Administrator of the EPA in October 2017 and was confirmed as Administrator in February 2019. He earned his law degree at Washington University in St. Louis and his MBA at George Mason University. He's also an Eagle Scout. Administrator Wheeler, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we'll begin a round of questions. Each member will have 4 minutes to question the panel. Welcome, and you may begin your testimony.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for the introduction. And I do agree, I hope today's hearing is the start of a good open dialogue with the committee, between myself and the committee and my staff. Thank you very much. Good morning, Ranking Member Lucas and members of the committee. The Environmental Protection Agency is one of the world's leading research organizations. Every day, our scientists and researchers develop information and technology that are critical to protecting human health and the environment. Since I've taken the lead at EPA, I've visited 5 of our research facilities and the Lake Guardian, our largest research vessel located on the Great Lakes. I am regularly briefed by agency scientists, and I rely on their work and expertise. I'm always impressed with the rigor, integrity, and dedication of our career scientists and staff. I'm here today to discuss the ways that we are supporting and advancing their efforts. We are promoting science at the agency more than it has been in years, and these efforts are leading to groundbreaking advancements in environmental science. Earlier this week, for example, we announced approximately $6 million in new funding to 8 leading research organizations to advance our understanding of PFAS. This is just one of the many ways that we are delivering on our PFAS action plan, the most comprehensive multimedia research and risk communication plan to address a chemical of concern ever issued by the EPA. Our scientists, working in concert with the Department of Defense, are providing the research and technology to support the action plan. They're developing methods to detect and quantify PFAS in the air, water, and soil. They are evaluating methods to treat or remove PFAS from drinking water. They developed a draft toxicity assessment for Gen X and PFBS, and they are working to understand the potential toxicity for the many other PFAS and their potential degradation products. EPA is one of the few places in the world where this type of cutting-edge science is being conducted day in and day out. We're also leading the way on research for reducing childhood lead exposure. Our scientists are identifying high-risk areas and providing technical assistance for reducing lead in drinking water and at contaminated sites. Their modeling efforts and research activities are directly impacting major regulatory decisions, such as our forthcoming proposal to update the lead and copper rule, the first major update in over 2 decades. And the same outstanding researchers who provided vital information to help Flint, Michigan, are now working with state and local officials in Newark, New Jersey, on their efforts to ensure safe drinking water for the city's residents. To support our scientists and researchers, we are continuing looking for ways to make the agency more effective and more responsive. That is why we are restructuring the Office of Research and Development. We've briefed many of you and your staff on this reorganization, but I'd like to reiterate that it will help ORD better address the increasingly complex environmental challenges of the 21st century. It will not result in the loss of jobs. It does not change any of the important work ORD is tasked with, only how we manage those functions. And I'd like to remind you that this effort was led by EPA career staff. We plan to have the reorganization in place by October 1st. Earlier this month, we took another step in modernizing the agency by committing to aggressively reduce animal testing. This issue is very important to me personally. Advances in computer modeling and in vitro testing are surpassing animal testing, and we need to keep pace. I issued a memo that commits the agency to important goals, such as reducing mammal study requests and funding by 30% by 2025, and then eliminating all requests and funding by 2035. Any request for funding after 2035 will require the administrator's approval on a case-by-case basis. We also announced $4.25 million in funding to 5 research universities to advance the development of alternative test methods for evaluating the safety of chemicals that will minimize and hopefully eliminate the need for animal testing. Finally, we are committed to the highest quality science. Good science is science that can be replicated and independently validated, science that holds up to scrutiny. That is why we're moving forward to ensure that the science supporting agency decisions is transparent and available for evaluation by the public and stakeholders. I cut my teeth as a career employee at the agency working on the Community Right to Know Act. I fundamentally believe the more information we provide to the public, the better our regulations will be and the more they will trust our decisions. At the same time, we will ensure that we're not disclosing confidential or personal information. Other agencies already do that, and we can do the same. Our proposed rule will apply prospectively to final significant regulatory actions, and we intend to issue a supplemental proposed rule to our science transparency regulation early next year. I'm very proud of the science we do at the agency. As you all heard at a recent hearing, EPA has one of the strongest scientific integrity policies in the federal government. The GAO report recently examined our policies and those of 9 other agencies, and we are the only agency that received no recommendations to correct deficiencies. That is a testament to the tremendous work of the EPA career staff. I will continue to support them in their work, and we will ensure that the EPA of the 21st century remains a global leader in science and research. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I'd like to ask now unanimous consent that Representative Axney be allowed to join us on the dais. And then further, I'd like to acknowledge and recognize Mr. Tonko for the first round of questions since he has to leave. Mr. Tonko.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate your flexibility, and welcome, Mr. Administrator. EPA established its scientific integrity policy in 2012 in order to formalize the agency's approach to honesty, communication, professional development, and expert engagement on scientific issues. As you likely know, the Government Accountability Office's review of scientific integrity policies at several federal agencies highlighted the EPA's robust scientific integrity policies. I would like to congratulate the EPA for its impressive scientific integrity policy, particularly as I work to pass the Scientific Integrity Act, which would codify, standardize, and strengthen scientific integrity policies across our federal agencies. I just heard your closing statement, but I want to ask again, until we can codify this requirement, can I expect your continued support for your agency's robust scientific integrity policies?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, sir. And chlorpyrifos, is a pesticide that causes severe short and long-term health impacts. Agricultural workers have collapsed from exposure, nauseated and convulsing. Particularly horrifying are the impacts of chlorpyrifos on developing fetuses and young children. When EPA proposed in 2015 to ban the chemical, it cited studies showing that at 3 years old, the likelihood of highly exposed children developing mental delays were significantly greater than those with lower prenatal exposure. But just this past July, EPA announced it would allow chlorpyrifos back on the market. I have a series of questions that I would ask you respond to in yes or no fashion. In rolling back EPA's recommended ban on chlorpyrifos, did the agency consider its own findings about the severe health and developmental consequences for children and workers exposed to this pesticide, sir? Yes or no?
Our career staff looked aggressively at the science that we had.
That's
making the
yes.
decision.
EPA previously stated that the agency's assessment contains sufficient evidence to conclude that negative neurodevelopmental effects from chlorpyrifos occur at exposure levels below the currently permitted level. Are you aware of the, yes or no, of the findings in this report, the EPA's revised human health risk assessment?
I'm aware of those, but we are currently reviewing
So-
the pesticide,
Okay,
and we're on
that's a
track
yes.
to review it by 2022.
Thank you. Did EPA base its decision to allow industrial use of chlorpyrifos on new, unrevealed scientific evidence that contradicted or discredited the agency's 2015 analysis? Yes or no?
I would have to get back to you on that because I want to make sure I don't misstate on the science that the career scientists used for that decision.
Please do so in rapid fashion. Did this specifically include the evidence of chlorpyrifos impairing the brain development of children and fetuses? Yes or no?
I can't comment on the specific studies that the career scientists used for their determination. I would want to, I don't want to misspeak.
Well, these are
on behalf of the
important,
scientists.
it's
I
very
understand,
important
but I take the
questions, so we-
recommendations from my career scientists on chlorpyrifos, and they've recommended that we continue with it
Thank
while
you.
they undergo the longer review.
Thank you, sir. I just want to use my time here. In 2017, your predecessor, Scott Pruitt, announced that EPA would delay the 2015 proposed ban on chlorpyrifos, citing regulatory certainty for industry as his reason. Mr. Wheeler, can you remind me the stated mission of EPA?
Our mission is to protect public health and the environment.
Thank you, sir. Is there anywhere the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, where regulatory certainty for industry is named as an evaluation criteria for EPA's decision-making?
We try to provide regulatory certainty for everything that we do, certainty for the American public, certainty for the community.
So is it a yes or no?
Nothing specifically in that statute, but we tried to provide regulatory certainty for all of our decisions, and we try to make all of our decisions open and transparent for everybody to see what science.
So am I assuming that's a no?
I have to go back to remember what the wording of your exact question.
Well, is there anything within FIFRA where regulatory certainty for industry is named as an evaluation criteria?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So it's a no. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I expect the theme of this hearing to be climate change, with particular criticism aimed at the President's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to believe that without international agreements, burdensome regulations, or trillions of dollars spent on the Green New Deal, it's impossible to protect the environment. But as I said in my opening statement, data tells us another story. The United States is a leader in reducing emissions. Yet we remain one of the largest economies of the world. Administrator Wheeler, can you provide the committee with the progress the EPA has made to date in cleaning up air, water, and land, and what steps you plan to take to keep America as the gold standard of environmental protection around the world?
Absolutely. We are the gold standard. Everybody else in the world looks to us. The EPA measures 6 criteria air pollutants. We've done that since 1970. Those 6 criteria air pollutants have been reduced 74% since 1970. Our air is 74% cleaner. All 6 of the criteria air pollutants have been reduced during the Trump administration. In 1970, again, at that time on the water side, 40% of our water sources did not meet EPA's standards on a daily basis. Today, over 90% of our water supply meets the EPA standards every single day. That doesn't mean to say that the remaining don't meet the standards, but they occasionally may have a blip because of a contaminant, but we work with the states and local governments to make sure that those are very small, short-lasting, and that we get back to having clean, safe drinking water for everyone across the country.
Administrator, do you believe that we need a heavy-handed, top-down approach to environmental regulation? Or, based on the EPA's analysis, can a more flexible, state-led program be just as effective in the long run?
It can be, and we are working more cooperatively with the states than the previous administration. The Obama administration on the air side issued 10 times as many federal implementation plans instead of state implementation plans as the three administrations previous combined. We have been turning those FIPS into SIPs on the average of 1 per month. We also inherited 700 SIP backlog. We've already reduced that backlog by 400. So we are working cooperatively with the states to make sure that they are protecting the environment of their residents.
Administrator, what about incorporating new technology? I've heard from my constituents that it can be difficult to demonstrate new technologies for emissions control, or monitoring to meet regulatory standards. Have you considered new ways to encourage the adoption of innovative technology solutions in your regulatory approach?
Yes, and that's part of what we based for our decision on methane. We want to make sure that we're not stifling technological developments in that industry. On natural gas, methane is natural gas. Natural gas has doubled in production since 1990. At the same time, the industry has reduced their methane emissions 15%. We want to make sure that we don't go forward with a regulation that is going to stifle innovative technologies that are capturing the methane emissions and making sure that we don't have those emissions.
Thank you, Administrator. Yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you. Mr. Wheeler, in June, you wrote to Congress that Mary Nichols of the California Air Resources Board was not negotiating in good faith with the EPA to reach a compromise on vehicle fuel emission and tailpipe standards, and that she was lying when she told members of Congress in the Energy and Commerce Committee that she'd made a sincere counter proposal. But it's my understanding that the counteroffer that the CARB made is essentially the voluntary agreement that was reached with the automakers earlier this year, announced on July 25th. So it sounds to me like Ms. Nichols was telling the truth to the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I would like to ask unanimous consent, Madam Chairperson, to put into the record an article from the LA Times about this issue. Mr. Wheeler, would you be willing to share the briefing materials prepared by EPA staff that analyzed California's offer to EPA? Would you be willing to share that with this committee?
I'd have to certainly share what we can with the committee. There may be deliberative documents involved in that. But I want to just make sure you understand the offer that Mary Nichols gave us last fall. She said at the time that, although she was putting it on the table, she said that the outgoing governor did not sign off on it, the incoming governor didn't sign off on it, the attorney general who already threatened to sue us didn't sign off on it.
We are going to sue
Members
you.
of her board did not. Her members of her board hadn't signed off on it. And she also said that
If I may, my time is limited because what she offered is what the deal they basically made with the auto. And at the same day that they did that, the Department of Transportation indicated that the administration did not prevent manufacturers from building more efficient vehicles on a voluntary basis if they wanted to. So I think the threats that are being made by the administration are really contradicted by the Department of Transportation's comment at that time. I'd like to also note that Senator Feinstein has sent a letter to the Attorney General pointing out that I really think it's an abuse of power on the part of the Department of Justice to try and threaten automakers who are reaching an agreement with the state I represent to deter other automakers from entering the same deal, but they're not disagreeing that with the other deals that are being made. For example, rear seat reminder systems that are being made, and that's not being challenged as an antitrust violation. So I just want to say, express my concern not only about the decision that was made here. I mean, California had more than 100 waivers in the last 50 years by both Democratic and Republican presidents, and to achieve a standard that has made automobiles 99% cleaner than they would have been otherwise. The lawsuit that is going to be engaged in is going to, you created chaos here because the automakers are not going to know what to do. This is going to be tied up in court for the foreseeable future, and I would hope that you would take a look at the chaos that has been created for clean air, but also in the auto industry by the actions that have been taken that are really unprecedented in the history of the Clean Air Act. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
It's important to remember that we're doing nothing to take away California's ability to set health-based standards for automobiles, only energy efficiency.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Wheeler, I'm extremely interested in that last exchange regarding Mary Nichols. You were enumerating everybody that basically hadn't signed off. Would you go back through that list again and explain why that was?
Certainly. What she put on the table was basically the Obama plan spaced out over one additional year. And she said that, although she was putting it on the table for us, that the outgoing governor, and this was right around the election last year in California, the outgoing governor had not signed off on it. The incoming governor hadn't signed off on it. The attorney general, who already said he was suing us, had not signed off on the deal. And she is the executive director of CARB. She said that the board members of CARB had not signed off on it. So it really wasn't a deal. It wasn't really an offer that she could stand behind or that she had any authority, apparently, to make to us. I'd also point out that the deal that the Congresswoman mentioned with the 4 automakers, we haven't seen the specifics of that deal. Nothing has been released to the public, so I don't know if it's the same as what the CARB executive director put on the table last fall. I don't know if it's the same deal or not.
So you would say that's a pretty good example of not negotiating in good faith?
Yes, I would.
I would agree with that. I want to segue in and ask, Administrator Wheeler, are the comprehensive regulatory reforms you personally are undertaking at the EPA, which we appreciate, including policies such as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, Safer Affordable Vehicles Rule, and Waters of the United States WOTUS Rule, are they driven by any change of any views on air and water science? Or are they instead driven by an effort to restore the statutory authority provided to the EPA via the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, as well as other statutes?
Both. We certainly use science in all of our regulatory decisions, but you're right. On the ACE rule, it replaced the Clean Power Plan, but the Clean Power Plan never took effect because the Supreme Court issued an historic stay which showed that it was outside of the bounds of the Clean Air Act. On WOTUS, as soon as the Obama administration went forward with their WOTUS proposal, it was stayed by courts around the country. It was only in effect in 22 states. 28 other states were not following the Obama WOTUS proposal, which is why we had to withdraw it so that we could have one regulation for the entire country. We didn't think a patchwork approach would be useful for WOTUS.
Well, we in Texas, particularly in my district, appreciate that. We really do. Despite the overall decline in the number of unhealthy air days since 2000, there was an uptick in the number of bad air days in some parts of the country last year. Is this because the EPA is rolling back environmental protections, or how do natural events, dust storms, wildfires, variations in weather affect air quality concentration concentrations from year to year? How does that happen?
It's both. First of all, since 2000, we have strengthened the regulations. So, the regulatory determinations are tighter than they were. Plus, there are a lot of naturally occurring events around the country that contribute to bad air quality. I was in Alaska last month and saw the smoke from the fires firsthand outside of Anchorage. With the wildfires in California, that contributes significantly to poor air quality days across the West. Other fires do the same thing, which is why I really hope that the Forest Service, working with the states, can get a handle on these out-of-control wildfires, have more prescribed burns, try to clear out the underbrush so that we don't have these long-lasting fires that really are detrimental to public health.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Administrator and Madam Chair. I thank you, and I'm going to yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me welcome an additional attendance of members of the Clean Air Force. Welcome. Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Wheeler, in 2016, researchers in the EPA's Office of Research and Development updated the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, value for ethylene oxide, which is known as ETO. In doing so, they determined that cancer risk for inhalation of ETO was 30 times higher than previously thought. In August 2018, EPA scientists released the latest version of the National Air Toxics Assessment based on the new IRIS value. This revealed an elevated cancer risk in the communities around a commercial sterilization facility in Willowbrook, just outside my district, facility owned by Sterigenics. I not only represent families in the impacted communities, I also live there. Thanks to the state of Illinois, this plant is now closed, perhaps only temporarily. I've been calling on the EPA to act quickly to protect not only the families in these communities around Sterigenics, but those around ETO, facilities that use ETO for sterilization all around the country. We need the EPA to use the updated IRIS value for ETO to set a strong new federal emission standard that protects Americans all across our country from this dangerous carcinogen. I first wrote to you, then acting administrator, on September 21st, 2018, almost exactly 1 year ago. When will the EPA set a new standard for ETO to protect Americans all across our country?
We are working on 2 different rulemakings to address ETO, and both of those are in the works, but we have been working hand in hand with both the local government as well as the state. It was EPA that provided the monitors, the ambient air monitors, the modeling to determine what the impact was from Willowbrook. We worked with the state. They used our data to make the determinations that they did on that facility, and we worked with the facility to make sure that they were installing better technologies to capture the emissions so that it does not get into the neighborhood. There are a lot of issues around ETO.
Well, I want to make sure that, are you going to use the updated IRIS values? IRIS, according to the EPA's website, says IRIS assessments are the preferred source of toxicity information used by the EPA. And I want to make sure that you're committed to using this updated IRIS value for the cancer risk for ETO when developing this new standard. Are you committed to that?
We are using the IRIS assessment for our regulatory decisions. It's important to remember that the IRIS program is not a regulatory program. So we also have to make sure that we are following the regulatory requirements of the statutes, such as the Clean Air Act, that we are using to set the standards for that facility for ETO.
I just want to make sure that you're going to use that, because there's been some arguments against it, and it's critical that that science is not ignored.
We use all of our available science in making regulatory decisions, but again, the IRIS program is not a regulatory program.
I want to close by reiterating a request from my neighbors in Illinois who would appreciate your participation in an October 2nd town hall on ethylene oxide in Lake County. I firmly expect the EPA to do its job engaging with the public at this event. I appreciate the air monitoring around the facility in Willowbrook, but it is important that EPA set a standard to protect Americans from this dangerous cancer-causing chemical, and US EPA needs to act quickly and decisively on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. And I know you're also concerned about the Great Lakes. Last month, we announced first ever trash-free Great Lakes grant program to help get the Great Lakes cleaned up.
Thank you. Mr. Babin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Administrator Wheeler, thank you for being here. A few weeks ago, you commented on an often overlooked provision of the Clean Air Act, Section 115, an integral part of President Trump's decision to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. you said another aspect that a lot of people gloss over is that under the Clean Air Act, if we enter into an international treaty, such as the Paris Climate Accord, if we fail to meet our targets, those are enforceable under our domestic laws. While this issue gets very little attention, this seems like a very big deal to me. For example, we know that advisors to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign supported invoking Section 115, but recommended against mentioning it during the campaign, because I imagine they thought that using an obscure provision to regulate the entire U.S. economy would not poll very well. I would like to enter into the record an article written by the Center for American Progress titled "How the Paris Agreement Supercharges the Clean Air Act." Madam Chair.
Without objection.
Thank you. Which details exactly how far those on the far left would use Paris to impose overreaching climate regulations across the U.S. economy. Can you please elaborate on this threat from Section 115 and how it might be used to circumvent the U.S. Congress?
Certainly. First, I do want to just clarify my remarks from a few weeks ago. I didn't mean to suggest that that was one of the primary reasons President Trump used for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. I actually wasn't with the administration at the time, so I did not brief the president on the Paris Climate Accord. I know he cited trade issues,
Right,
as well as the fact that we were treated differently from China and India and other countries. But I completely agree with you that Section 115 could give, and I think the Center for American Progress paper on this is evidence of that there are certainly people that want to use that section of the Clean Air Act to allow third parties to sue the United States government if they fail to meet treaty obligations and force them to then meet the treaty obligations. And the Paris Climate Accord is a treaty. It wasn't submitted to the Senate for ratification, but it still has the same ramifications of a treaty.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, has the EPA witnessed lower demand for ethanol following the granting of small refinery waivers over the last 2 years? And do other agencies besides EPA conclude that ethanol demand has not been impacted as a result of these exemptions?
You're correct. Ethanol demand has not been impacted by the small refinery program. In fact, we've seen an uptick in ethanol over the last 2 years. So far this year, the industry's produced more ethanol than they did at this point last year, and we do not see any demand destruction from the small refinery program on ethanol production.
And other agencies you feel that have the same opinion?
It's my understanding the Department of Energy has that same opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Administrator, and I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler. I join many in the science community who are deeply concerned about the EPA's proposed rule titled Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. The proposed rule would impede, if not eradicate, the EPA's ability to fulfill its mission of protecting public health and the environment by limiting the scope of research that the EPA can consider in making decisions. As a cornerstone of its regulatory process, the EPA relies on peer-reviewed science, and the proposed rule perpetuates the incorrect notion that the science the EPA relies on is somehow hidden, and it's not. The information used by the EPA is not secret. I appreciate that your testimony acknowledged the need to issue a supplemental rule, but the proposed rule is an attack on the role of science itself at the EPA. So if finalized, it would have chilling consequences for the EPA and for people who benefit from clean air and clean water. So Administrator Wheeler, is the EPA's existing policy to consider scientific studies in the regulatory process, even if the underlying data is not publicly available in a manner sufficient for independent validation? That's just please yes or no. The existing policy.
With that data is not available to the public. I believe that the regulated public, the communities need to know what the science is based behind our decision.
But is the existing policy to consider studies even if the data is not publicly available? Is that the existing policy?
Yes, that is the
Thank
existing
you.
policy.
And have the federal courts upheld the EPA's longtime policy regarding consideration of scientific data?
I don't believe that the courts have specifically addressed that specific issue.
Well,
We received over 600,000 comments on our proposal. We've reviewed those comments over the last year, and that's why I believe we need to go forward with a
Well,
supplemental
in,
proposal.
in
before we
footnote
finalize it.
3 of the proposed rule, it says that the courts have at times upheld EPA's use of non-public data in support of its regulatory actions. So footnote 3 also says that the proposed rule acknowledges that the EPA has not consistently observed the policies underlying the proposal. Isn't that correct? The EPA has not in the
Yes.
past.
Yes.
Thank you. So the proposed rule represents a reversal of the EPA's position for decades regarding the consideration of scientific data. If the proposed rule is asserting that the agency's previous position was incorrect, what evidence do you have to justify it?
Well, again, I cut my teeth on the Right to Know Act, and I believe that the American public has a right to know the science behind our regulatory decisions. And I think if we put that science out for everybody to see and understand, then there'll be more acceptance of our regulatory decisions. And
And-
that is what's driving me on this question, is
And-
I believe that we should be transparent in everything that we
And,
do.
Mr. Administrator, the basis of the proposed rule, I agree with the scientific community, is flawed. So before finalizing the rule of such significance, I urge the EPA to listen to scientific experts. So yes or no, will the supplemental rule mentioned in your testimony be published prior to 2020?
I was hoping it would be published prior to 2020, but in my staff notes, I'm told early next year. Things seem to take a little
And-
bit longer than I like, but we
and
will
will-
certainly
will-
publish the
I wanna get a
supplemental
couple more
for
questions in.
public comment before we finalize it.
Yes or no, will you commit to waiting for the conclusion of the Science Advisory Board's comprehensive review before you finalize the final rule?
We certainly hope to have that. I specifically
yes or
asked
no?
the science, yes, I specifically asked the Science
Thank you.
Advisory Board to look
And-
at the proposal.
And will you commit to working with the National Academy of Sciences on the development of the proposed rule?
I don't believe we've reached out to the National Academy of Sciences at this point.
I hope that you will. And
But
the,
again, the science community is not unanimous on this. You said the science community is opposed to this. We had over 600,000 comments, a lot of scientists
I understand, and I want to get
support
just
what we're
another
doing.
quick question. The proposed rule is inconsistent with the agency's statutory obligation to use the best available science as required in many statutes under your jurisdiction. Would the proposed rule retroactively apply to the EPA's existing standards and regulations?
Our proposal did not retroactively apply, and there was still an exemption so that the administrator could allow a study that was important to move forward, even if that science wasn't available to the public, if we needed to use that study for regulatory purposes.
Thank you. My time has
Thank you
expired.
very
I will
much.
be submitting more questions for the record. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here. As you know, the Great Lakes are critically important for my home district in Northeast Ohio, providing fresh water, recreation, and certainly economic growth to our region. It's hard to overstate the importance of this critical resource to Northeast Ohio. I've co-sponsored legislation to fund R&D to assess the health of the Great Lakes fisheries, but I'm interested in the work the EPA is doing to protect the environmental health of the region. Can you provide an update on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, particularly recent efforts to reduce pollution from stormwater and excess nutrient runoff?
Absolutely. And first, thank you, Congressman, for asking about the Great Lakes. As you know, I'm also from Ohio.
Yep.
I keep saying this, and nobody's corrected me, so I'll keep saying it until I'm corrected. I believe I'm the only EPA administrator to ever go swimming in the Great Lakes. I have absolute love of the Great Lakes region and the Great Lakes themselves. And this summer, I visited our Lake Guardian research ship, which travels all 5 of the Great Lakes, has been doing it for about 30 years now, taking water samples, comparing them year over year to see the changes in the lake. We are moving forward on nutrient reduction work. We put forward a proposal this past, not a proposal, a new policy this past spring to work on trading mechanisms with farmers to reduce the nutrient loading into the rivers and streams that flow into the lakes. We announced our Trash-Free Lakes program, where we're trying to get the litter cleaned up out of the lakes, and we're moving forward on a number of fronts to get the lakes cleaned up.
Fantastic, and I certainly appreciate that work. Are there any emerging technologies that could be applied to reduce the type of pollution, and how can we support that in this committee? Can we talk a bit about the technology side?
Well, there is a lot of scientific research going on here. We do a lot of scientific research on the HABs, the harmful algal blooms. We have a number of different EPA labs around the country that are looking at specific issues and problems, including our Region 5 lab in Chicago for the Great Lakes. So there's a lot of scientific research going on, and our EPA researchers are at the forefront of that research worldwide.
Fantastic. And then shifting a bit, so the U.S. generates the largest amount of municipal solid waste per person on a daily basis. Now more than ever, it's important that we rethink how we recover and repurpose the valuable materials that used to be considered waste. EPA has an important role to play by encouraging recycling and recovery. Can you describe how EPA is engaged to do this, and then how does this tie into the EPA's role in the Environmental Cooperation Agreement in parallel with the USMCA?
Thank you. Last fall, we held the first ever recycling summit at EPA to take a look at the recycling crisis, which we actually have a recycling crisis in our country today. We're also working aggressively on food waste. Food makes up the largest single contributor to municipal solid waste in this country, and we have to do something to reduce the amount of food going to the waste sites. But the USMCA, the USMCA is the first ever trade agreement from the U.S. that incorporates environmental provisions into the trade agreement itself. In NAFTA, the environmental provisions were in a side agreement. They were not part of the actual trade agreement. We also have the first ever language in a trade agreement dealing with ocean plastic debris, which also helps us in the Great Lakes. So this is the first time the strongest environmental protections ever included in a trade agreement are in the USMCA.
Fantastic. And with that, I will yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome Administrator Wheeler over here.
Sorry.
You'll understand where I'm coming from here, being from Ohio. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, represent areas right along the West Virginia and Ohio border. And our part of the country has made incredible contributions over the years to the nation's economy and, I think, national security, from steel production to coal production, glass, all the things that Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia have done. And I think the production of natural gas is the most recent example of that. And where I live, it's everyone from the scientists who figured out this miraculous technology of going more than a mile underground and 2 miles sideways, much of which was developed in our national lab system, by the way. It was a public investment because of how good it is for us. To the pipe fitters who build the pipelines, the heavy equipment operators, the truck drivers, even you'd be amazed the businesses people made out of just making sandwiches for all these people in the last 15 years. It's been incredible for our area. But the thing is that people in Western Pennsylvania know that all of that economic growth rests on one important contribution, which is that we have helped the United States emit less carbon in the last 15 years than it ever did before because of the switch from coal to natural gas. And that's a big part of why the economy will continue demanding this fuel going forward, and that if we do not stop leaking methane and we lose that climate benefit, this entire industry is threatened. It's about the environment, but it's about these people's jobs, all these people that I just mentioned. People know that where I'm from, and that's why many of us were so surprised to see your comments about the reduction and elimination of the methane standards, where you said just last month that you believe they were unnecessary and duplicative. So my first question for you is just a simple yes or no. Do you still believe that the methane standards are unnecessary and duplicative?
The Obama methane standards, we put forward our own proposal last
So
month.
you believe that the Obama methane standards were unnecessary and duplicative? Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm quoting you, yes. So when you said that, I looked around to see what other people said, and I just wanted to share a couple of those things with you because the sources are kind of surprising. So one, for example, to maximize the climate benefits of gas, we need to address the Achilles heel and eliminate methane emissions. Did you read that in the press when it was out? Does that quote sound familiar to you? That was Susan Dio, the president of BP. It was no environmental activist. Similarly, we will continue to urge the EPA to retain the main features of the existing methane rule. That came from a spokesman from Exxon. Gretchen Watkins, who runs USA operations for Shell, which is building a huge ethane cracker plant in the middle of my district, said that methane is a big part of the climate problem, and frankly, we can do more than we're already doing. She said, we don't usually tell governments how to do their job, but we're ready to break with that and say, actually, we want to tell you how to do your job. So BP, Exxon, and Shell all believe that the EPA's action to reduce and get rid of the existing methane rule is a bad idea. And it sounds like someone else, when they testified in front of the U.S. Senate and said, climate change is real, I'm concerned about it on a level of 8 or 9 out of 10, and that part of the way the EPA was addressing climate change was through their methane program. Do you recognize who said that?
It sounds familiar.
That was you.
I thought so.
When you testified to the United States Senate to get this job, you said that the methane program was a crucial part of eliminating greenhouse gases. You have changed, and it threatens the livelihood of people in this industry that I represent. And
don't-
so I will simply ask you, my time is up, reconsider. These families are depending on this industry and depending on the climate benefits that have come from it. We have to do it the right way. You are on the wrong side of both business and public opinion. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Sir, we don't do our regulations for big business. We take a look at all business, including small and medium-sized companies that are in this area. So we don't write our regulations to appease the large companies.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Wheeler, thank you for coming. I want to talk to you today and discuss the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. The Clean Water Fund provides communities, as you know, with low-cost financing, and I think that's an important aspect of it. It's financing for water quality infrastructure projects, and it's a critical tool for Florida in addressing a number of our water challenges. There's a massive disconnect in this fund, Mr. Administrator. On the one hand, Florida has the third most significant infrastructure needs in the nation, according to the EPA's Clean Watershed Needs Survey. So third highest needs, yet Florida is receiving the third lowest in the country allotment, again, according to the EPA. It's a result of an antiquated formula, not the agency's fault. It's from a 1987 law that Florida receives the third lowest allotment. EPA's acknowledged in a 2016 report to Congress that the Clean Water State Revolving Fund allotment, it acknowledged that, quote, in the EPA's report, most states do not currently receive appropriated funds in proportion to their reported needs or their population, which has demonstrated the inadequacy of the current allotment. The report also states, quote, the weighting and factors that were used to establish the formula for the original allotment are not known. So basically, and the Congressional Research Service says the same thing. In fact, they said it's even difficult to guess how this formula came about in the 1980s. That's probably not a surprise to some people. Obviously, Florida's population has exploded. We're gaining 1,000 people per day. This disconnect is unacceptable, given our needs. So bottom line, Mr. Administrator, I recognize this as a statutory issue, or Administrator Wheeler, do you agree that it's reasonable for Congress to relook this 30-year-old formula, given this disconnect?
I have to be careful. I need permission from OMB before I endorse legislation. I will say when I worked in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we tried to change the formula 3 or 4 Congresses in a row. And my staff and I worked at trying to update it. We spent a lot of time, and we ran into a lot of roadblocks from states who would have done worse under the changes to the program.
Will you commit to working with me on this issue as we look to reauthorize the program in next year's WRDA bill?
Yes, be happy to work with you on that.
All right, great. And separately, this is National Estuaries Week. I want to thank you for the good work that the EPA is doing in administering the National Estuary Program. I have the Indian River Lagoon in my district. In July, this committee passed H.R. 335, the South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act of 2019. The legislation established an interagency task force on HABs to really get some empirical data behind that issue. Will you submit for the record what the agency is doing in reducing algae blooms and how you think your agency can contribute to this task force? And in the interest of time, could you also submit for the record what the agency is doing on coastal resiliency and helping states that have coastal resiliency problems with rising seas?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Administrator. And
thank you.
Madam Chair, I yield my time.
Thank you. Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. Good morning, Administrator Wheeler. Thank you for being here this morning. I have quite a few topics to cover, so I hope we can move through this fairly quickly with our limited time. In June of this year, the staff of the EPA Region 6 lab in Houston were informed that the lab would be shut down and the scientists and engineers would be relocated to the ORD lab in Ada, Oklahoma to consolidate space. You touched on this issue a little bit in your remarks, but I remain concerned, and more important, my constituents are very concerned that this lab consolidation will lead to significant brain drain, as many of the EPA employees may not be able to relocate, resulting in a loss of key technical expertise. This is an issue that has come up at my town halls in Houston. So I think it's really important. I sent a letter to you with some of my colleagues in the Houston delegation on July 12th asking you to reconsider this closure, and I would like to know when we can expect a response to our July 12th letter.
We're trying to get a response to you as quickly as possible.
And as I'm sure you know, Houston has experienced increasingly frequent and intense storms like Imelda that's happening right now, and all in the same space as arguably the world's largest petrochemical complex. And so there's a lot of risk in our region that we remain concerned about and want that EPA, the scientists on the ground there. And in fact, in some of these disasters, the EPA scientists have really been another kind of first responder, if you will, that are there to protect the water and air quality and to inform the public. I assume you would agree with me that the public has a right to be informed about the dangers in the water and the air.
Absolutely, but the scientists we would be moving to Ada, Oklahoma are not our first responders. Our first responders will remain in Texas, plus we will have a small lab facility left in Texas behind. But we were directed by Congress to consolidate our space, reduce the size of our footprint. It was a 2016 legislation, I believe, told us to get out of leased spaces and try to consolidate to GSA or EPA-owned space. And the lab in Houston is my understanding, is in very poor shape and would require a lot of government investment to bring that lab up to the quality of lab that the people in
Well,
6 deserve.
And I appreciate that, Administrator Wheeler, but it is my understanding that those employees who are staying will be relocated to another lab. So it seems that because there will be new space that is obtained, that our request that the scientists remain in Houston on the ground to be able to perform testing and do things immediately is important. And again, there's a larger concern that this speaks to about the overall concerns for brain drain across the country as folks are relocated. And it's no disrespect to my colleagues from Oklahoma. I'm just south of Oklahoma, but certainly in the world that we live in, some of these scientists may have families who are unable to relocate either because of spouses' professions, because of children's commitments, because of medical commitments, whatever it is. So it is hard to relocate so many people. And what we have seen is that there has been a significant departure from the EPA over the last few years. And so do you agree? I assume you agree that it's essential that the EPA fulfill its mission to protect the environment and public health.
Absolutely.
Yes? And do you agree with me that the loss of scientists to levels that we haven't seen since the 1980s is a concern?
Absolutely. 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire over the next 5 years. I hired a new human resource manager the start of the spring, and recruiting new scientists is a huge concern of ours. I actually interviewed the human resource manager. I'm told that EPA administrators don't typically do that. That's 3 or 4 levels below, but I wanted to make sure that we got the right person
Good.
to help us guide the agency.
Administrator Wheeler, I have limited time, so I want to get to one other question, then I will have some additional questions to submit for the record. But in our Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment hearing yesterday, I asked your Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water, David Ross, for clarification on the EPA's justification to reverse the 2016 decision to issue new rules to safeguard against the release of hazardous substances into local water bodies and drinking sources. He said it was rulemaking out of the Office of Land and Emergency Management that was not his program. Is it true that the Water Office is not involved in decisions regarding the release of hazardous substances into water bodies?
Well, they are involved, but in fact, that particular regulation that you were referring to, that we decided no additional regulations were needed, we have other regulatory programs that protect that, including under the water program, under EPCRA, and under CERCLA. And if you don't mind, I'd like to submit, I don't know, for the record or to you, a paper outlining what we're doing under America's Water Infrastructure Act that was signed by Congress last year that addresses this problem.
Thank you. I'll submit my additional questions for the record, and Chairwoman Johnson, may I also submit the letter that we sent on July 12th for the record as well?
No objection.
Thank you. I have
Thank you, Ms.
exceeded my time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. We receive yours for the record as well. Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome Administrator Wheeler. This hearing is called Science and Technology at EPA. Every member of this committee, Democrat and Republican, demands the EPA's actions are driven by science and technology only. No politics should ever enter into your decisions. They should be subordinate to science and technology. I was here for all 8 years of President Obama's administration. Over and over and over, the administration let politics overtake science and technology. The best example hit my home region of Houston, Texas hard. Ozone. As you know, Administrator, that's one of the 6 criteria pollutants under NAAQS. The last year of George W. Bush administration, science and technology said we could go down to a requirement of 0.75 parts per billion for ozone. It took President Obama 8 years to put out the rules to comply with President Bush's science-based proposal. And then 1 year later, in 2015, President Obama lowered those standards to 0.70. There was no science, no technology that justified that. No, as you said, right to know for the public how they achieved that standard. And there's no way they could know because we hadn't gotten down to 0.75 yet. And so, to your great credit, the administration, the Trump administration, has addressed the backlog of SIPs. As you mentioned, you've gone down from 700 to 400. Now you have looming a new ozone standard put out by 2020. My question is, are you on track to put those standards out? And most importantly, using science and technology. You look at ozone we can't control because you know and I know, the whole world knows, over half the ozone that comes to America comes from uncontrolled sources, sources like China, like our neighbors south, Mexico have crop rings. So how do you take those into account with these new ozone standards?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the question. Yes, we are on track. We are reviewing both the ozone and PM NAAQS at this point. We plan to go final with both of those by the end of next year. For ozone, it will be the first time that we have completed that within the statutory 5-year requirement. The EPA has always taken longer to review these NAAQS, and we are committed to getting them done in the statutory timeframe of 5 years, which is required under the Clean Air Act. It's important to remember, though, and I'm taking a lot of criticism in the press from a lot of different people saying that we're going too fast. Congress required us to update it every 5 years. That's what we intend to do. When we finish the 5-year review, the next 5-year review starts the very next day. So this is a never-ending review of the NAAQS standards for both ozone and PM, all 6 of the criteria pollutants. So it is our intention to get it done on time and then to start the next 5-year review the very next day.
I had a bill that gave you authority to go for 10 years if you not demanded, but if you need that time because of all the hassles. Would that be a good bill to have? It got through the House twice, dropped the ball in the Senate, but how about give you the flexibility? Is that something you like? I'm sure you would.
Oh, again, I can't endorse specific legislation. I think having more flexibility is always a good thing in general. And again, pointing out that the agency has never completed it in 5 years before, which is one of the reasons why we had to disband the subcommittees. And I've taken, I know I've received questions from this committee about the subcommittees and reinstituting them. We can't reinstitute the subcommittees and meet the 5-year requirement under the statute.
And one
Thank you
final
very
accolade
much.
from back home, Hurricane Harvey hit what's called the San Jacinto waste pits very hard. These are waste pits that cover very hazardous material, dioxin from paper manufacturing right there in the area. They came loose during Hurricane Harvey. That is the chemical that got the Superfund started, Love Canal. You guys stepped to the plate quickly and said, we will get all that chemical, all that dioxin out of the water. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You saved lives by acting so quickly. I yield back.
I appreciate
you
your
very
thanks.
much.
I do have to say that I'm recused from that particular
Ms. Stevens.
site. So I was not involved in any of the decisions. I don't want to leave the impression that I was involved in something I was recused of.
Mr. Administrator, the purpose of this hearing is indeed to review the science and technology activities at the Environmental Protection Agency. And as the subcommittee chair for this committee on research and technology, I take great interest with this topic. And you might be aware that we are facing a conundrum with our nation's recycling. The U.S. still only recycles 9% of its plastic. In 2018, China banned the import of most U.S. plastics collected for recycling because many were mixed with non-recyclable waste and contaminated. And we have heard from municipal leaders across this country, and I've heard from many in my home district in southeastern Michigan. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976 named the EPA as the lead agency on a national effort to recover valuable petroleum-based resources that were filling our landfills. So the question I have for you is, why is the EPA not fulfilling its statutory responsibility to lead federal efforts on cross-cutting research and development and innovation needed to address the nation's plastic recycling challenges and create jobs?
What we held the first ever recycling summit last year at EPA headquarters. We brought in people involved in the entire recycling chain, from people who produce the raw materials to the packagers of products, to the manufacturers of the products that they package, to the waste collectors, recycling collectors, all the way to the end of this value chain of people who take those products and turn them into useful products. We have a recycling crisis right now, and we charged them last year with four items to go off and work on. We've been working with them throughout the year. We're going to have the second recycling summit this fall on National Recycling Day. In the past, EPA only put out a press release announcing Recycling Day. We're actually bringing people in and trying to solve the recycling crisis that we currently face.
And so how do you see the EPA helping states and municipalities improve recyclable materials and manage their recyclable goods? Are they involved in these conversations? Were they at your summit? Are you working with
Yes, we
them?
had industry, we had local governments, we had the waste collectors. And in fact, it will be held on National Recycling Day, which I believe is right around November 15th. If you would like to come to our summit and address them, we'd be happy to extend an invitation to you. But this is, I think, a very important issue. I don't normally compliment the Atlantic Monthly, but they did a pretty good piece back in February on the recycling crisis that this country faces, in large part because China quit accepting recycled material, and we don't have enough products for material to go into. My fear is that people, average citizens, think that if they separate their recycled material from their trash in the bins at the end of their driveway, that the problem is solved, and that is not solving the problem.
Well, we're hoping that my appropriations to fund a national recycling strategy through the EPA will get passed into law and give you additional dollars, and appreciate your recognition of this challenge and certainly what it means. I'd also like to encourage you to look at some of the economic data that can be collected for the recycling industry, given that that hasn't been done in 12 years. And I will also give you credit for immediately responding to the letter that I sent your agency about recycling, and look forward to additional dialogue and potentially a summary of the conference that you had last year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Administrator Wheeler, I'd like to also urge you to review your rescission of the Obama methane and VOC regulations. And in light of that little colloquy there with Congressman Lamb, would suggest that you might leverage the leadership of Exxon, BP, and Shell to establish a level playing field and bring up the smaller competitors, like companies that I'm involved with, that should comply with that stuff and can do it if you help level the playing field. The other thing is, you were good enough to send down Mary Walker from EPA Region 4 to participate in our Crisis of Harmful Algae Bloom conference, and she was super helpful and offered a lot of insight about the voluntary reporting system and some of the septic and water nitrogen problems that we're seeing. So I'd like to see if you have any further comment. This is a critical issue for Ohio and Michigan, but it's also a really critical issue for Southwest Florida. Thank you.
It is, and we are working on both those areas on the methane. It's important to remember that methane is actually the product that the natural gas companies are selling. They already have an incentive to not leak it. We want to make sure that our regulatory approach does not stifle innovation and stop companies, small, medium, and large, from creating innovative new ways to approach the issue, to capture the methane and make sure that they're not leaking the methane, which is why we're tying the new proposal to the VOC emissions. So VOC emissions will go down, and as a side benefit, methane emissions will also go down. But the natural gas industry has doubled since 1990, and they've reduced their methane emissions 15%, and we want to make sure that our regulatory program does not get in the way of innovation.
I can understand that. I'm involved with two $3 billion gas producers in the Permian.
Yes.
And I'm just saying they could use your steady hand to raise the bar and create a better platform for medium and small companies who care about this and will pay the money to capture the methane versus the unscrupulous companies that won't.
Yeah, and we will. Thank you.
Thank you.
And on the HABs, we're definitely, and I'm glad Mary was able to go to your conference in Florida on this. It is certainly an issue that we're looking at across the board. Several of our research labs, including our main research lab and Research Triangle Park, is intimately involved with this issue. We're doing groundbreaking research to trying to identify where the problems are before they occur. We're trying to identify what are the symptoms, for lack of a better word, of what will cause an outbreak in a water source, and to try to make sure that we're safeguarding not just drinking water, which is the most vital importance here, but also recreational waters.
Yeah, our
It's hurt a
HEBs
lot
are
of
so
areas.
bad down there. We're well beyond preserving drinking water. You can't
Right.
even get near that stuff without sinus problems. And we really appreciate the research and the early warning system that Mary talked about.
And our career scientists at the agency and a number of our labs are doing groundbreaking research in this area that is second to none worldwide.
Thank you, sir. I yield my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I know you've been quizzed about the website, but let me just ask you a personal question. Do you believe that climate change is occurring and is substantially human-caused?
I certainly believe it's occurring, and I believe that man is certainly contributing to it, which is why we are aggressively addressing it, why we went forward with our ACE regulation this summer, why we went forward with our methane, and why we are finalizing our CAFE proposal. We want to make sure that we are addressing climate change, and we are addressing it.
Okay. I want to focus on methane. I personally live just about as close as anyone to S25, the well that spewed forth the largest methane leak in the history of America, I believe in the history of the world, in Porter Ranch, California. Now, methane has an effect on global warming, roughly 87 times as potent as carbon dioxide in warming the planet. But that's the harm if it's pure methane. But what's being stored in Porter Ranch and what is being piped around the country is not always pure methane. It's methane mixed with volatile organic compounds and the mercaptan that gives it its smell. So 8,000 families were evacuated in my area for months. The health effects still continue. So I was a bit concerned when your agency proposed a rule to eliminate federal requirements that oil and gas companies install technology to detect and fix methane leak from wells, pipelines, and storage facilities. Millions of tons of methane, and inevitably with those volatile organic compounds and with the mercaptan, are leaked, vented, and otherwise released into the atmosphere. I believe in your rollback, your agency acknowledged that the rollback will degrade air quality and are likely to adversely affect health and welfare. Why shouldn't oil and gas companies be required to detect and monitor natural gas leaks?
They are detecting and monitoring natural gas leaks, and we are targeting VOCs. And when you target VOCs, you also have the side benefit that it's also a target of the methane reductions as well. The Obama administration in their methane proposal expanded the source category without proper Clean Air Act procedures. So that was what we rolled back. was
Well,
the
now,
expanding
this
of the
Congress,
industry.
in light of the Porter Ranch blowout disaster, passed a law requiring that we have national natural gas storage safety regulations by, I believe the date was the middle of last year. PHMSA, and I realize this isn't under your direct agency, but you can publish regulations on your own in addition to what we require of PHMSA, said that they're in compliance because they published regulations by the deadline under the Obama administration and then withdrew them. So Congress wrote a law saying you've got to have regulations, and as of the middle of last year, and we have no regulations. Do you think it's appropriate for the executive branch to take a law that says you must regulate something and say, well, we regulated it for a day and then we withdrew the regulations, so we're in compliance?
I do not know the history or background on that. I don't really want to comment on another agency's regulations.
Can
Our
we count
proposal-
on, given the effect this has had on children, on people, on cancer, can I count on you to use your power to regulate natural gas storage safety?
And that is what I believe we are doing with our new methane regulation that we just put out for public comment. We're taking comments on it right now. We're targeting VOCs, which also address methane, and I welcome comments from the public before we go final with a regulatory decision.
I would hope that you would at least go as far as the American Petroleum Institute's recommended best practices. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Over here. Thanks for being here today. I'd like to first start off by saying I've talked to a number of people in my district. We have industry, we have agriculture, who appreciate the EPA's new tone, if I can say that, in the sense of understanding that the people working in these industries and districts are also living in them and care very much about an environment, and then having an EPA that works with them as a way to try to find a way to yes, as opposed to looking for a reason to say no, keeping in mind all the important necessary cause to ensure our environment is protected. In light of that, I am encouraged by the fact that the proposed budget was actually less than what we've spent in the past. There's a tendency up here to define success by how much money we're spending on something as opposed to the actual outcomes of proposals or projects or legislation. Could you speak to some of the decision-making process that went into proposing a budget that came under cost of last year, and how you balanced those priorities of making sure that the EPA is doing its job and that we're spending our money wisely in light of a $22 trillion debt?
Absolutely. For the most part, the programs that we recommended to be reduced or eliminated were voluntary programs at the agency and not critical to the statutory authorities that we have. In other words, programs that had grown over time at the agency but were not authorized by Congress. We still put forward some new proposals for new funding. The new OWEA Act that passed Congress last year, but Congress did not fund for 2019. We did request funding for that. We believe it's a very important program to address some of the water quality issues, in particular for small and rural water systems and medium-sized systems around the country. So we did ask for additional funding for that. We also asked for $50 million for a children's health program for safe schools. We have a lot of different programs at the agency that address different aspects of environmental issues at schools, but they're kind of disjointed, and what we want to do is bring those all into one program. And we asked for $50 million so that we can go out and work with the states and local governments to do site-specific recommendations on how schools can become healthier for the children who go to school in those buildings. There are different issues with a number of schools around the country, and we want to make sure that the children have a healthy education.
Following up on that a bit, earlier this year, you proposed the EPA developing rules that require cost-benefit analysis of new EPA regulations, again, with the understanding that we have a responsibility to manage the resources both of creation and of the taxpayer dollar. Could you speak to any progress being made on that rule?
Certainly. We put that out, I believe it was last year, for notice and comment. We received over 3,000 comments. I was actually surprised. I thought we would get as many for the science transparency rule, but for the science transparency, we received over 600,000 comments. For the cost benefit, only 3,000. What we proposed, though, was one regulation to apply to all of EPA's regulations for cost benefit. What we have decided to do in reviewing the comments, and again, both for science transparency and this, we took a hard look at the comments that we received from the different people commenting, and we decided instead of one regulation to try to mandate cost-benefit analysis across all of our statutory programs, we're going to go statute by statute instead and issue a regulation under each of our statutes. The first one will be under the Clean Air Act. We hope to have that proposal out by the end of this year, but it will require cost-benefit analysis for all Clean Air Act regulations going forward, and then we will systematically go through each of our statutes and do an individual cost-benefit requirement for each statute, tailor-made for the statutory authorities under each of the statutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Cohn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Wheeler, appreciate your being here. I've been disturbed, alarmed at several actions or inactions that have been taken at the EPA under your leadership. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. Very concerned about how often you have ignored, apparently, your own professional scientists, seemingly at the expense of people's lives, in favor of profit companies and private profits. You've sidelined your scientists, gutted the 2015 coal ash rule, rolled back Clean Water Act protections, weakened the mercury emissions rule, and rescinded the Clean Power Plan. These are all disturbing. And in my city of Memphis, we've had coal ash collected at our steam plant, and it's possibly could end up in the waters at our wonderful artesian water wells and threaten our drinking water. The mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment, but it doesn't seem that that's been the direction. On asbestos, we also have a problem. And in May, I sent you a letter with 34 of my colleagues after learning that the EPA disregarded the advice of its own scientists and lawyers by issuing a rule that restricted but did not ban asbestos. In a memo written by your own staff in August 2018, they stated, rather than allow for any new use of asbestos, the EPA should seek to ban all new use of asbestos because of the extreme harm from this chemical substantially outweighs any benefit, and because there are adequate alternatives to asbestos. Yet on April 17, 2019, the EPA issued a new rule that did not ban asbestos outright, as your own scientists recommended. I find this incredibly concerning and extremely peculiar that the EPA would concede its own experts' advice on banning asbestos, a known human carcinogen that has killed millions of people over the last several decades. A recent study of research has shown that asbestos-related disease costs 39,275 deaths in the United States annually. That's more than double the previous estimate of 15,000 deaths per year. Additionally, at least 55 countries have banned asbestos completely. Yet in response I received from your office, I was informed that the EPA cannot ban asbestos until a risk evaluation is completed and an unreasonable risk is determined. When, sir, will this risk evaluation be undertaken and completed, and is the death of over 39,000 people a year not considered an unreasonable risk?
First of all, we have done more on asbestos than any administration since the George H.W. Bush administration. We are moving forward on asbestos under the new TSCA regulation, which is the law that Congress gave us to ban chemicals. That is a 2 to 3 year process that Congress set up for us. In order to fill in the gap in the meantime, while we're working through the asbestos under the TSCA regulation, we put out a significant new use rule, which does not allow any new uses of asbestos to go forward without having first come to EPA. So we plugged a loophole that would have allowed people to import asbestos products from other countries such as Russia. So we have done more to stop asbestos and to ban asbestos than any administration has done since George H.W. Bush.
Let me interrupt you for just a second because
in the
time's
late
precious.
80s.
That just means you did more than President Obama. And while President Obama is a great guy, that's not, be stronger than one person is not a great deal. But let me ask you this again, the question. When will the risk evaluation be completed?
Under the process set up, by Congress under TSCA. It's a 2 to 3 year process. We included asbestos as one of the first 10 chemicals that we are addressing. We did more than the George W. Bush administration, than the Clinton administration, than the Obama administration. We've done more on asbestos than
Thank you,
anybody
sir. I
has.
appreciate that. I have been affected closely by this. Warren Zevon was my best personal friend, and he found out he had mesothelioma. He died within about a year of finding it out. That caused his death. There was nothing you can do with mesothelioma. You're dead. And it was caused from probably something he experienced as a child in an attic, breathing in some air. So I'm concerned about it. I hope you'll get your study done in the soonest time possible. Too many lives have been taken by this harmful carcinogen, and your agency can do something about it. Thank you, sir, and I
we
appreciate
are.
your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Herrera Bueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. I wanted to applaud your administration and your efforts with regard to repealing the WOTUS rule, the erroneous, burdensome WOTUS rule, and your efforts to clearly define navigable waters in a common sense form. I'm concerned that the regulatory process alone may not be enough to prevent future administrations from attempting the same overreach as the Obama administration did with their rule. I've introduced legislation that clarifies the definition of navigable waters, but I wanted to ask you, it'd be nice if it didn't take an act of Congress, but do you think that even with the rule that you've put in place, congressional action to refine the definition is necessary with regard to what's coming?
Again, I can't endorse specific legislation. I will say, again, when I worked in the Senate as a staffer, we worked on trying to define waters of the U.S. Through multiple Congresses. You know, the original Clean Water Act definition in the 1970s said navigable waters, and it has been expanded a lot over the years by Supreme Court decisions. So what our regulation, our proposal does, we've not finalized our new definition. We hope to finalize it this winter. But what our proposal does is follow the Clean Water Act, as well as the Supreme Court cases, to provide what I hope will be a working definition so that anybody, any property owner can stand on his or her property and be able to tell for themselves whether or not they need a federal permit without having to hire an outside lawyer or consultant to tell them whether or not they have a water of the U.S. on their property.
Absolutely.
That's my overarching goal for the new definition.
And we support
Everybody
you in
should
that.
understand what the definition is.
In addition, they shouldn't have to spend the upwards of $275,000 per permit and wait up to 800 days to get that permit per body of water.
Yes.
In addition, Washington, switching gears slightly, shellfish growers on the Pacific coast are struggling to find a solution for ghost shrimp. This industry produces more than a quarter of our nation's oysters and provides thousands of jobs in rural areas like my district. Now, the Washington State Department of Ecology, which is not, it's not you all, but they do administer under the EPA. They're also the state administrator for the feds. They've been very unhelpful. They've reversed their original approval, denying a permit to spray a widely used pesticide that would have helped the growers manage this problem. And my question is this. Basically, I'd like to understand what your role is with regard to the state agencies, and would you be willing to meet with me or my office to help us find a solution to preserve this vital industry?
I'd be more than happy to meet with you and your office to try to help you with this issue. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. McNerney.
I thank the chair and I thank the administrator for appearing this morning. The EPA Science Advisory Board met earlier this year to discuss which of the agency's actions would benefit their from their science review. Specifically, they mentioned the rulemaking to establish light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emissions standards and the corporate average fuel economy would, quote, not warrant further review, provided the EPA and the California Air Resources Board agree on a rule harmonized across the United States. If, however, the EPA and CARB cannot agree on a harmonized rule, then the board is ready to review pertinent scientific data in the different rules. That's a quote. At the time, the EPA would not confirm to the SAB, the Science Advisory Board, that talks with CARB broke down. Those were not acknowledged. However, your agency will be revoking California's vehicle emission standards waiver, a move without precedent that prioritizes polluters over public health and the wishes of the auto industry itself. It appears that this action is a malicious attempt to undo a popular, common-sense Obama-era rule. Given the non-response from the EPA and concerns about the underlying science used to back deregulation of the SAB did decide to review the rule. Please answer with a yes or no. Do you support the role and expertise of the SAB can provide to assess underlying science backing regulatory actions?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Yes or no, will you commit to cooperating with the SAB's review of the proposed rule to revoke the California's vehicle emission standards?
We want to make sure that the Science Advisory Board is reviewing scientific issues and scientific questions. I believe they are reviewing the rule, and we certainly welcome anyone's input, but we are in the final stages we've just released step 1 this morning of SAFE, and we will be releasing step 2 in the coming weeks.
So in other words, you're not going to be cooperating with the SAB's review of the proposed rule?
We
And
cooperate
I asked
with
you
the-
again, this was asked you early, will you commit to not finalizing the proposed rule until the SAB has had time to review, to complete its review?
No,
Will you
we
make
will-
that commitment?
No, we will not wait for that. I don't believe at this point they're looking at specific science questions within the regulation. You know, it's interesting.
That's an opinion that's not shared across the board, Mr. Wheeler.
I understand that. It's interesting, during the Obama administration, the Science Advisory Board wanted to review the Clean Power Plan, and Gina McCarthy told them no, that there were no scientific issues in the Clean Power.
So you're saying 2 wrongs make a right?
No, I'm just saying that sometimes the Science Advisory Board wants to get outside of scientific issues. We've asked them, and we have also committed going
So why is it
forward
called a Science
that we will
Advisory Board
be
if they're getting
briefing
outside of
them
science
on
opinion?
all of our major regulations on a going forward basis. The CAFE standard was proposed last December. So as, for example, the methane, we will be briefing the Science Advisory Board on our methane proposal and seeking their input for it. But on a going forward basis, we are asking the Science Advisory Board to review our regulations as they come out for public comment.
Well, thanks for your opinion, Administrator. It appears that your agency has been dismissive of the Science Advisory Board and timed to avoid input from the board on this action. And nothing you've said today changes that conclusion. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and good morning, Mr. Administrator Wheeler. Thanks for coming today. First of all, on behalf of my farmers and ranchers, thanks for all the great work that you have done and your office has done for those farmers and ranchers. I want to applaud you for giving us a sorghum oil pathway to diesel, for giving my farmers and ranchers some relief on the waters of the U.S., and thank you on behalf of all the corn farmers in America. Thank you for giving us E15 year-round. I want to kind of continue down this biofuels pathway and just get a quick thought on you on E30. From what I understand, E30 has about 60% less emissions through a tailpipe. It's usually about 20 cents less per gallon at the pump, and maybe has a little bit better gas mileage. Are you all looking into E30, and any thoughts on the future of E30?
Well, we just completed E15, and right now we're looking at the overall RFS program. We look at all blends of ethanol, so we're looking also at E85. I don't know that we're specifically looking at E30 or not, but I can certainly get back with you to let you know if our scientists are in fact reviewing E30.
Thank you, and thank you for looking at the E85. I'm hearing lots of good words out there on the streets from the people who are using it as well. I guess one of our biggest concerns back home is the small refinery exemptions. And the question I get from farmers is, how do you define what a small refinery is? And I understand, like Frontier Refinery, and where I grew up in El Dorado, that's a small refinery. Coffeyville, Kansas has a small refinery. How do you determine what's a small refinery who really needed the exemptions versus some of the others?
Well, the definition of small refinery is in the statute itself, and it's based on barrels of oil produced at the refinery. But I do want to just, there is a misperception in a lot of areas. It's not the size of the corporate parent. It's the refinery itself. It's not the refiner. So, for example, a very large company can own a small refinery. Department of Energy is the one that takes a look at the small refineries. When the small refineries apply for the small refinery exemption, they apply to EPA. We send the request to Department of Energy. They review the economic data to determine whether or not there is a hardship based under the statute for each refinery. not the parent company, but
So
the
if a parent
refinery
company
itself.
owns 5 oil refineries, do they lump together for the number, or you take each one at each location?
Each one, each location. The statute defines it as a refinery. So for example, a large company may own a small refinery in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. If that
Do you feel the number that we're
refinery-
using as a good reflection is a good number? Or is that in statute?
It's in statute.
Okay, let's talk about glyphosate for just a second. Okay, so biochemistry major, a medical physician, certainly I'm concerned about people's health. And I'm confused myself. Which federal agency, is it the EPA or the ATSDR, is tasked with regulating and vetting the safety of glyphosate?
That would be EPA under our pesticides program.
Do you feel there's any infringement going on by other folks like the ATSDR?
We always welcome science reviews by other agencies and departments. We often look at the work that they do, not just within our country, but also other countries. We look at different international bodies. For glyphosate, we took one of the most comprehensive looks at that chemical, that pesticide ever by any regulatory body anywhere in the world. Our conclusions are that it is not a carcinogen, and those conclusions match regulatory bodies around the world.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Murray, during your confirmation hearing, Senator Whitehouse asked you about the action plan developed by your former lobbying client, the Colbert and Robert Murray. That plan, which is commonly known as the Murray Memo, presented a series of asks from Murray's fossil fuel company, one of Donald Trump's largest owners, asked to the Trump administration, asked essentially a series of actions to gut the environmental protections and climate action in this country. So I offer with great dismay what we might call the Trump administration's report card for delivering on what your former client, Mr. Murray, asked you and the EPA to do. Murray asked you to cut the EPA workforce in half, but you only supported the Trump budget, which only cut it by 1/3, so let's call that an incomplete. He asked you to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. You did it right away, A+. He asked you to eliminate the Clean Power Plan. You've almost finished that, so we'll call that a B+. He asked you to eliminate the maximum achievable control technology standards, which regulate toxic pollution. He just proposed a big loophole to allow increases in that pollution, so that's a B. Murray wants you to end cross-state air pollution rule. You didn't do that yet, but you've weakened enforcement, so maybe just a C. And we're still unclear on his request that you withdraw the endangerment finding for greenhouse gases, which is a legal basis for all of our regulations to fight climate change. You haven't done this yet, but your former boss, Senator Inhofe, says you think you'll do this, quote, eventually. So did you take these directives right from Mr. Murray, and do you plan to complete the rest of Mr. Murray's tasks?
Well, I appreciate you keeping score. As I've said many times, I've never read the Murray Action Plan. I didn't have it, I didn't write it, and I didn't read it. So this recitation of the items in there is the first I've heard of many of those that were included. So no, I'm not following that plan. I don't have a copy, I never read it, I don't have it, I didn't write it. I've said that throughout over the last 2.5 years since the beginning of my confirmation process for Deputy Administrator.
Well, I appreciate your clear statement on that. And I am dismayed that there's such an overlap between the leadership that you have offered and what the Murray Memo says. One of the vast numbers of ethical complaints raised against your predecessor, Scott Pruitt, was that he politicized the EPA's response to Freedom of Information requests in order to hide his own wrongdoing. I raised issues about this last year, possible violations of your ethics pledge, and I confess you've been a significant improvement on Scott Pruitt with ethics are concerned. I'm baffled, though, that you have overseen changes to the FOIA process, which would essentially codify Scott Pruitt's politicization of the FOIA process. Members of Congress don't like it, environmentalists don't like it, journalists don't like it. Why are you making it harder for the American people to find out how the EPA is making decisions?
We did not do that. We're not doing that. Congress, EPA last changed their FOIA regulations around 2000. Congress amended the FOIA statute 3 times since then. In 2016, the last time Congress amended FOIA, they required all agencies and departments to update their FOIA regulations. EPA did not do that under the Obama administration. We were behind. Most other agencies already accomplished that in 2016 or 2017. The changes to our FOIA regulations follow the directions Congress gave us in the 2016 FOIA amendments. That was all that was done. It did not change our process, in fact. It was mostly housekeeping items. The only change we made was to centralize where the FOIA requests come into at the agency, and that was a recommendation from GAO, where they took a look at our FOIA process at EPA and said, you should have a one-stop place for all FOIA requests. So that was the only substantive change we made to our FOIA regulations. The
Why do you
rest of
think
it
there's
is
been
blown
so
out
much
of proportion.
pushback from the various communities of concern?
I don't know. I'm at a loss. I guess there's a lot of people, particularly journalists, that believe that on whatever we do, there must be a nefarious purpose to it. The FOIA regulations were actually drafted by our career attorneys in our general counsel's office, had very little to no input from any political people on my team. And again, it was just following the direction that Congress gave us in the FOIA amendments of 2016.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just focus on, and Mr. Wheeler, thank you for your service. Let me focus on obsolete committees. You're aware in July of this year, hearings were held on the federal advisory committees at the EPA, and they focused on the potential impact of President Trump's executive order on advisory committees. Based on the characterization made by many of my colleagues and their friends in the media, you would think this order was a death blow to science at all the agencies. In reality, this just seems like a common sense, nonpartisan way to eliminate wasteful committees. When this order was executed at your agency, do you believe it will have any consequences, negative, I guess, for the ability of EPA to protect the human health and environment?
No, I don't believe it will have any negative impact at all.
So that was a good move.
Yes. You know, to paraphrase President Reagan, I screw up the quote a lot. The closest thing to immortality is a government program once created. And I think taking a look at our advisory committees, the ones that were not required under statute to determine whether or not they still have a useful purpose for the agency was a very important step for us to take. And I'm very pleased that President Trump asked all federal departments and agencies to undertake that.
So what he did is similar to what every business goes through, every family budget. You evaluate the things you're doing. If it doesn't make sense, you eliminate it or pare it down. If it does make sense, you go forward with it. So this has no impact, negative impact, in your opinion?
No, and while I can't comment on what we've recommended to the White House as far as disbanding FACA committees, I do want to clarify, because there has been misreporting in the press that we're going to do away with our Children's Health FACA. We just published in the Federal Register, I believe this week, reconstituting that FACA, so we are not doing away with the Children's Health FACA. I can say that. I cannot say which ones we've recommended to the White House, however.
And how many committees were affected by this?
I believe we had approximately 12 committees that were created, not by statute, but just by administrative creation. And we examined all 12 of those, approximately 12. And we examined those to see whether or not they should be eliminated. And we made our recommendations to the White House, and the White House has asked all agencies and departments not to discuss our recommendations until they've had a chance to review all of the departments and agencies.
So none of the agencies that were eliminated were statutory. It was all administratively administered or started out. And what he did was actually help. I would make the argument it would be helping the agency, wouldn't it?
Yes. I think every agency should periodically take a look at organizations like that they have to see whether or not they still make sense to continue. I think it was a very useful exercise. There were a couple of committees, to be honest, that we looked at that hadn't met in several years. So you have to wonder whether or not it's a useful purpose if they aren't even meeting.
Everyday Americans do.
Yes.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I will yield the balance of my time to Chairman Lucas.
I thank my colleague. Director, let's discuss for just a moment. There's been topics and discussions here. Is there anywhere in federal law, is there anywhere in custom, is there anywhere in administrative policy down through the years where EPA is charged with tailoring its decisions to match the needs of the biggest corporations or the needs of a few particular states? Don't you have a broader jurisdiction than that, a responsibility?
We try to look holistically at the impact of all of our regulations across everyone. The ETO, the ethylene oxide that I was asked about earlier, One of the reasons why we're going a little slower on that is we've been asked to do a small business SBREFA panel to take a look to see what the impacts might be for small businesses. We have to take those into account before we go forward with the regulation.
So the whole country, the impact on the entire nation, every citizen, not just particular places or particular entities.
Yes.
Fair statement? Thank you, Director. Yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Administrator, thank you for being with us today. This past June, the EPA finalized its Affordable Clean Energy Rule, known as the ACE Rule, as a replacement for the Obama-era Clean Power Plan. In past hearings, you've insisted that the ACE Rule will reduce emissions by 34% from 2005 levels by 2030. However, EPA's own analysis of ACE notes that the rule will only decrease emissions between 0.7 and 1.5% below baseline. Even more alarming, the analysis also notes that repealing the Clean Power Plan and replacing it with ACE will lead to 1,400 premature deaths, 15,000 more cases of upper respiratory problems, and 48,000 more cases of asthma. How can I go back to my constituents in Florida and tell them that this rule is supposed to protect their health and the environment when the EPA itself admits that the rule will cause over 1,000 deaths and at best marginally reduce emissions?
Well, first of all, Congressman, I don't believe that's true. First of all, the Clean Power Plan never took effect. So you can't compare a regulation that is on the books to something that was a pie-in-the-sky dream by the Obama administration that was outside of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Power Plan, it was subject to the historic stay by the Supreme Court. And I believe that that happened because the Clean Power Plan was outside of the Clean Air Act. It did not have the statutory authorization that was necessary for a regulation. So the Obama administration put forward the Clean Power Plan, never took effect, so you can't compare what might have happened for a regulation that was not grounded in the statute itself. I have to admit, the number you quoted for our ACE rule, I'm not familiar with that. I'd like to get back to you on that specifically. I don't think I've said by 2030. I think what I say is 34% reduction below 2005 levels over the course of the regulation. Now, that course may be 2030. I don't remember the year off the top of my head, but I will get back to you to answer the specific question that you had on the other reduction level.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Administrator.
Thank you.
Of course. Your agency's website clearly states that EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment. Given the findings and the impact analysis that your agency produced, it's clear that the ACE rule doesn't come close to meeting what anybody would look at that mission to be. I appreciate that you're going to check, but I'm not comparing two things. I'm only citing what your own agency has said the effect of the ACE rule would be.
That was in our proposal, not in the final regulation, that comparison. And again, the Clean Power Plan never took effect, so you can't really say that the Clean Power Plan would have saved any lives since it was never effective. Nobody was complying with the Clean Power Plan. And again, when we stepped in and we saw that the Clean Power Plan had been stayed by the Supreme Court, people turned to us. I had people from the right that said you shouldn't do anything. You should overturn the endangerment finding. I had people on the left that said you need to defend the Clean Power Plan, even though the stay from the Supreme Court. But what we did was we took a look at the Clean Air Act. We determined what the statute required us to do, what it called for us to do. We wanted to make sure that we were reducing CO2 emissions from the electric power sector because we were required to do that under the Massachusetts versus EPA decision. And we went forward with a regulation, the ACE rule, that we believe follows the Clean Air Act and will reduce CO2 emissions from industry. Again, people didn't want us to do anything. They thought we should overturn the endangerment finding. Other people, of course, like the Clean Power Plan, even though it never took effect. But what we did was go back to the Clean Air Act itself, take a look at the requirements were, the Supreme Court decision, and we put forward a regulation that we believe will reduce CO2 emissions from the electric power sector.
I certainly hope so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Wexton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for joining us here today. We've all seen the recent headlines about office relocations being carried out by other departments within the federal government. Right now, the USDA is in the process of rushing through the relocation of 2 agencies from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City, despite being unjustified and in violation of the law. And the Interior Department has proposed to move most of the Bureau of Land Management's D.C. staff to Colorado and has started notifying employees this week of where their jobs will be moved to. It's apparent that these moves are not to save the taxpayers' money or provide better services to constituents, but instead to sideline the scientific work that's being done by these agencies and further the agenda of this administration to dismantle crucial parts of the federal government. These radical decisions have already created a devastating consequence for the offices and the affected employees. Many of these federal employees are my constituents. They are dedicated, hardworking people who want only to serve our country. They don't deserve to be pawns in a political game. So I want to give you the opportunity right now to reassure EPA employees in the greater Washington, D.C. area and in other hubs around the country like the North Carolina Research Triangle and Cincinnati, Ohio, that there are no plans to disrupt their lives as part of a political agenda against the federal government and scientific evidence. So I ask you directly, yes or no, does EPA have any plans currently under consideration to relocate substantial numbers of EPA employees or functions out of the D.C. area or from one region of the country to another?
First part of the question is easy. No, we do not have plans to relocate substantial numbers of people out of the D.C. area at all. On the regional side, we are trying to move some of our labs. I don't know if you were here earlier when I had the question about the Region 6 lab in Texas. We're moving that from a leased space in Houston to a EPA-owned facility in Ada, Oklahoma, but it's still within the region. We want to make sure that we have a regional lab in all 10 of our regions, but we are moving some of our labs to EPA or GSA-owned space, which is what Congress required us to do in 2016.
And are you moving it? Are you moving it to space within the same general geographic region?
Yes. With one exception, which predates me, and that decision I believe was made by the Obama administration, we moved a large part of the Region 9 lab in California to Oregon, I believe. But that was a decision from several years ago.
I'm going to reclaim my time. I'd like to speak for a moment about David Dunlap's role in IRIS formaldehyde review. The senior-most political official that oversees IRIS, David Dunlap, recently left a long career with Koch Industries, which owns one of the largest formaldehyde producers in the country, you may be aware. In February of 2018, Dr. Dunlap emailed your Chief of Staff, Ryan Jackson, from his Koch email address. In that message, Mr. Dunlap urged Mr. Jackson to review some of the studies and said he would, quote, provide inhaled formaldehyde does not cause leukemia in humans. 6 months after that, Mr. Dunlap came to work for the EPA. 3 months after that, the IRIS review of formaldehyde had been eliminated. This timeline speaks for itself. Questions for the record were issued to the agency regarding Mr. Dunlap's participation in decision-making around formaldehyde. The EPA finally spent responses on Friday, 5 months later, but ignored those questions. So I'll ask you again here. Was David Dunlap involved in decision-making related to formaldehyde prior to his December 2018 recusal?
Not to my knowledge. He hasn't briefed me on formaldehyde, and to my knowledge, he hasn't been involved in any of the formaldehyde decisions. He recused himself from that. The process that we used on the IRIS process actually started before he joined the agency, and that was the IRIS program itself has had problems dating back to the early 90s when I first started working at EPA. I wanted to make sure that our regulatory programs can utilize the IRIS assessments when they come out. So we started a new process last summer where there had to be an agreement between the IRIS program and the regulatory offices within EPA as to what their assessments going forward would be and what the regulatory
And I apologize, but I'm out of time. And I know that you said not to your knowledge, but would you be willing to get confirmation of that he did not have any involvement with that decision-making process throughout your entire agency and provide that confirmation to this committee?
Yes, I'll be happy to look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Wheeler. Yesterday, the President announced that this week the EPA would be issuing a notice of violation for environmental pollution to the city of San Francisco. Could you walk us through the timeline for the scientific studies, legal determinations, and technical measurements that led to that announcement?
At this point, I can't comment on a potential EPA enforcement action. We've not taken any official steps yet. We're still looking into the issues, and it's not I can't comment on a pending or potential enforcement action.
But when the President said it was coming this week, is it routine for you to issue notices of violation, whatever that means, with less than 1 week of preparatory work?
Again, I didn't see where he said it was happening this week, but
it was carried in multiple news reports from the reporters that listened to his comment.
Fine,
sure. I take those at face value as well. But yeah, so you're telling us there was no preliminary action? There had been no finding that San Francisco, for example, how was San Francisco chosen as opposed to Miami or Bedminster, New Jersey, or wherever else you might think of finding environmental violations?
Again, I can't comment specifically on a potential pending enforcement action as the agency head. Before we take an enforcement action, it's inappropriate for me to comment publicly on anything that we may be doing on the enforcement side.
But you routinely, apparently, if the President decides something and a week later he expects the EPA to issue a notice of violation, take some official action, is that the way you do business, or was the President saying something that was not true there?
I don't want to comment on my conversations with the President, but again, on enforcement actions, I cannot comment on a potential pending enforcement action.
This is a matter of how you do business. Can the President show up 1 week and say, I think we should issue a violation, the EPA will do it, and then you fast track all of the, all of the scientific, legal findings, everything?
No, that is not how we do business, and that.
How can it logically be true that when the President announces that within a week we're going to have a notice of violation if that is not the way you do business? I'm just trying to understand the logical gap.
If we do take an enforcement action, and once a decision is made whether or not we are going to take enforcement action, I'd be more than happy to brief you and your staff on the decision process that we took.
Okay. Will you be able to get, for the record, will you be able to get back to us?
Comment publicly.
Okay, but will you be able to get, within a week, when the President announced you would be doing it, can you get back either with the notice of violation or an explanation for why what the President said was not correct, one or the other?
I'm not sure within a week, but we certainly, after we make a decision.
But if you never make a decision because it turns out that the statement that he was making was not supported by facts, then we will making no promise. Within a week, you can figure out what's going on.
I will get back to you as soon as we can with statements explaining our actions or why we're not acting.
Quick question. Often when you decide to alter or abolish a regulation, it's a cost-benefit analysis. The costs are measured in dollars, and the benefits are measured in saved human lives. And so that to do that balance, you need to know, what's the value of a human life in dollars. How do you think about that problem, and what is your best number and the one you try to operate in making that balance?
We always want to show that the benefits of a regulatory action outweigh the costs.
But all right,
that is why we're moving forward with a
human life.
statute-by-statute approach on cost-benefit analysis.
Right, but you need to convert the benefits of human lives and compare them with the cost in dollars.
Yes.
So you need a calibration. What is your calibration?
We do that on a regular basis. Some of our statutes require different balances. Some require no consideration of cost. I'm thinking of the NAAQS in particular. When you set the science-based standard for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, we're not supposed to take costs into account. So we take a look at the science, we take a look at the impacts on human life. So it differs from statute by statute, but we do take that into account. And in our regulatory analysis for all of our regulations, we explain the balance and the cost factors and the benefit factors that we use for each individual regulatory decision. It was one reason why, instead of having a cost-benefit regulation to apply to all of our regulations, which is what we proposed last year, we decided instead to do it on a statute-by-statute basis because of the differences between the statutes. We can't just come up with a simple formula for cost-benefit analysis for all of our regulations. We have to look on a statute-by-statute basis.
I guess.
Thank you very much. Mr. Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. First off, do you confirm that the EPA has found that current and projected levels of greenhouse gas emissions threaten public health and the welfare of current and future generations? Yes or no?
Yes, I believe that was the engagement finding by
Okay,
the Obama
that's,
administration.
that is the organizations we work for are bigger than us. I'm just focusing on the organization. Second, I want to clarify, you had said to Mr. Christ a moment ago that essentially intimated that the estimates of ACE versus the Clean Power Plan are an apples to oranges. I'm holding in my hand the report that the EPA issued. I flipped at random to page 325, and it says the base case is the Clean Power Plan, and then goes through and does comparisons. This entire justification for the ACE is compared to the Clean Power Plan. All the numbers, Mr. Christ, do you confirm that this report throughout all of these pages compares ACE to the Clean Power Plan?
That was in our proposal. Our final action did not.
The numbers that
comparison because we decided that the Clean Power Plan was not the rule of.
The numbers that Mr. Christ cited were consistent with that. So do you confirm then that while
Not
the,
from our final regulations, sir.
do you confirm that while the Clean Power Plan was designed to reduce emissions by 32%, your proposal was designed to reduce emissions by 0.7 to 1.5%? Again, I'm quoting your own report.
Again, that was the proposal, not the final action. We took comment on that, and our final numbers are in our final regulation where we finalized in July. So you're taking the numbers from our proposal and they changed.
So you confirm that this report is an accurate statement from the EPA. Do you also confirm that this report says that the ACE proposal would result in as many as 1,400 additional deaths by 2030?
No, that was looking at the Clean Power Plan, if the Clean Power Plan had been enacted. And again, the Clean Power Plan was stayed by the Supreme Court, so it was
Okay,
never.
sir, I will submit this to the record. These numbers are in here. Now, I am
From the proposal,
concerned.
not from the final regulation, though.
Sir, I have spent the first 7 years of my career in the sciences, the next 16 years running a business. You've had a distinguished career in lobbying. I do not have the luxury in my career of selectively interpreting facts. I want to stay on facts because I'm really concerned with the way that you have analyzed facts. When you considered the impacts of the ACE proposal, do you confirm that you reduced the discount rate for future analyses from 3% to 7%?
I believe so, but I'd have to get back to you on that specific.
Okay, I will so stipulate that that is in the report. That has the practical effect of essentially lowering by about a factor of 4 over a 30-year plan, for those of you who are not fluent in compound math, to the cost of the proposal. That is not the only place that the ACE changed. On page 164 of the proposed rule for ACE, table 17 shows that there is a net benefit of going from the Clean Power Plan to ACE. On the very next page, page 165, it says that if you include the health impacts, which I think is in your mandate, that there is actually a net cost. Do you confirm that the justification for ACE omitted the health impacts?
No,
of
again,
reducing
that is from our
coal-fired
proposal, and you're citing something that we took comment on. The final agency record on this regulation was our final regulation issued in July. It was not from a
Okay,
proposal that we received comments on and modified and changed before we went final.
Madam Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter these documents into the record. I want to move on with the moments I have left here.
Without objection.
When you appeared before the Senate for your confirmation hearing, Senator Merkley asked you about a study from Boston University, Harvard, and Syracuse that had recently been published. The study found that the ACE proposal would provide zero meaningful reductions because it effectively allows plants to bypass pollution controls. At the time, you said you had not had time to review the study. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter this study into the record. Have you had a chance to review that peer-reviewed paper since?
I looked at it at the time, but again, that was based on our proposal, not on our final regulation, which we, and the justifications, we don't believe that that study was accurate.
Can you explain the discrepancy between the 34% reduction cited in the regulatory impact analysis and what the authors of the study found?
No, I cannot explain what the authors of the study found.
Will you commit to providing your analysis of why you think this is justified after this hearing is over?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wheeler, I skipped my questions so we could get more members. I'm going to submit them to you, which really has to do with procedure and decision-making. I wonder if you may be able to respond in a 2-week period.
We certainly strive to.
Okay. Thank you so very much for testifying before the committee. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee might want to ask the witness. The witness is now excused, and we thank you for coming. The committee is adjourned.
Thank you.